Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7. My name is Patryk Witkowski and joining me today is Dundee councillor Siobhan Tolland. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
First story of the day is a Ukraine update, day 664. The White House has warned that the US has only enough authorized funding for one more aid package to Ukraine this year before Congress would be required to greenlight new contributions to Kiev. More than 40 former US and NATO diplomats and defense officials have urged Congress to approve new aid to Ukraine, warning that losing its war with Russia would be disastrous for Ukraine and threaten the security for the US and its allies. Ukraine's armed forces commander-in-chief Valery Zaluzhny has issued his strongest criticism to date of President Zelensky's decision to fire all of Ukraine's regional military recruitment heads in August in a corruption crackdown. Zaluzhny bemoaned the recruitment chief's sacking, saying these were professionals, they knew how to do this, and they are gone. Interfax Ukraine cited him as saying, Zaluzhny also said that the situation in the front line of a war has not reached a stalemate, despite comments published last month in which he described the war as moving towards a new stage of static and attritional fighting. Zaluzhny declined to comment on whether Ukraine plans counteroffensive operations over winter. This is a war. I can't say what I plan. What we should do, otherwise, it will be a show, not a war. He was quoted as saying, Finland signed an agreement to enhance military cooperation with the US, saying it saw a long-term threat from Russia. A day after Russia issued a warning over Helsinki's recent entrance into NATO. The EU adopted a package of sanctions on Russia that include an import ban on Russian diamonds, officials said. The package is the 12th packet leveled at Moscow since it launched its invasion of Ukraine. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said the new sanctions would truly reduce Russia's economic foundation for war. The sanctions are designed to reduce Russia's access to revenues, metals, and technology used to sustain its war effort. The EU will hold an extraordinary summit on the 1st of February to discuss its multi-annual budget, including funding for Ukraine, European Council President Charles Michel said. EU leaders agreed last week to open membership talks with Ukraine, but they could not agree on a €50 billion package to financial aid for Kiev due to opposition from Hungary. Russian President Vladimir Putin has urged traditionally male professions to employ more women to reduce major labor shortages exacerbated by thousands of soldiers being called up to fight in Ukraine. Russia has placed the renowned detective novelist Grigory Shikartizhov, known under his pen name Boris Akunin, on its list of individuals identified as terrorists or extremists for his criticism of Moscow's war in Ukraine. The writer, 67, has long been critical of Putin. French President Emmanuel Macron discussed topics including Ukraine and the situation in the Middle East with the UK Foreign Secretary David Cameron today. Moldovan Prime Minister Dorin Rasian said Moscow was the country's biggest security threat and that an upgraded anti-aircraft defense system is needed to counter threats from Russia. I was wondering, Siobhan Tolland, I was wondering if you think that the public needs additional convincing of funding for Ukraine, and if somebody is to do this convincing, who would it be?
You mean at a local national level or at an international level, do you think?
Wherever, if you think that on the local level the public needs to be convinced, then that would probably be the best area to talk about. Um,
I,
yeah.
I think that unfortunately what seems to be happening here and internationally is that we're kind of beginning to forget about what's happening in Ukraine, and Scottish Parliament has just supported Ukraine today, but there is that element that it does need to kind of come back into the public awareness, because I think what tends to happen, unfortunately, in kind of humanitarian and invasion crises like these is that people are up in arms for the first couple of months, but then we kind of become little bit war weary. Compassion fatigue is the phrase that's often get used, so it kind of tends to kind of fall off the agenda. So there is an element here that it does need to come back into the public consciousness, and there has to be kind of a level of awareness, I think, of what is actually happening. That goes the same for what's happening in Gaza as well, as I'm sure we're kind of going to move on to. But there is an element that sometimes when there's kind of discord across the global environment, that we tend to become a bit more insular, and I tend to kind of think a bit more insular, and we can't do that at this point in time. I think that the only hope that we kind of have for kind of global peace is that we do think outwards and think of the kind of the fate of other nations. It's a terrible thing that's happening in Ukraine, and it feels like we're kind of just stand by and watching it, slightly powerless as well. So yeah, I do think we do need to kind of up the public awareness, and bring it back onto the agenda.
Moving on to Israel and Gaza, UN officials have expressed anger and disbelief about the situation in Gaza's hospitals, where injured people do not have basic supplies and children recovering from amputations are being killed in the ongoing conflict. I'm furious that children who are recovering from amputations in hospitals are then killed in those hospitals, said James Elder, a spokesperson for the UN Children's Agency, on Tuesday. He added that the Nasser hospital, the largest operational hospital left in the territory, had been shelled twice in the past 48 hours. Nearly 20,000 Palestinians have been killed and about 1.9 million have been displaced. Israeli forces have demolished much of northern Gaza. A spokesperson for the Gaza Health Ministry has said at least 13 Palestinians were killed and 75 others wounded in an Israeli strike on the Jabali refugee camp in northern Gaza today. Israeli strikes killed at least 28 Palestinians in southern Gaza, and troops raided one of the last functioning hospitals on the north as the IDF pressed ahead with its offensive against Hamas on Tuesday, with renewed backing from the US, despite rising international alarms. Sirens sounded in Tel Aviv on Tuesday, and Hamas says it has launched a salvo of rockets against Israel's commercial capital. There was no immediate word of casualties or damage in the incident, which appeared to show the Palestinian militant group retained longer-range rocket capabilities, even as Israel pressed a Gaza war now in its 11th week. The EU's foreign policy chief, Josep Borrell, has said that Europe was losing moral ground with the rest of the world as a result of its stance on Gaza. Speaking at a conference in Aosta, organized by Le Grand Continent, he also said the EU has been unable to adopt a united view because some countries in Europe were feeling guilty as a result of the Holocaust and the Second World War. UK Foreign Office Minister Andrew Mitchell has responded to Lib Dem MP Layla Morin's reports about her Palestinian family's situation by saying he was particularly disturbed by reports of people trapped in a church in Gaza who are running out of food and water. The UN Security Council will convene today to debate a call for a ceasefire in Gaza after a previous attempt was vetoed by the United States. The vote was postponed to give more time for diplomats to meet US objections to the wording of a draft resolution. The Arab countries negotiating the text said they had been encouraged to see what the White House was apparently trying to find wording that it could support. The White House was apparently trying to find wording that it could support, as opposed to simply vetoing resolutions. Yemen's Iran-aligned Houthis said on Tuesday that they would press on with the attacks of the Red Sea and could mount a naval operation there roughly every 12 hours. U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin has announced the creation of a multinational operation in the Red Sea, including the UK, Bahrain, Canada, France, Italy, the Netherlands, Norway, Seychelles, and Spain. After a series of missile and drone attacks of Yemen's Houthis Italy's navy will send one of its frigates to help protect the Red Sea shipping route against attacks. Councillor Tolland, I was just wondering, are you worried by the borders of this Israel-Gaza conflict potentially expanding?
Yes. And it's not just the physical fighting that can the physical attack, sorry, that would spill into the borders. But what worries me more, I think, is the more kind of philosophical aspect of what's happening here. In that, what seems to be happening in Gaza is a whole new stage of what we think is acceptable behaviour from one country against another. We're sitting watching a genocide happening here, and it seems we're powerless to stop it. The US, the US shift, for instance. I mean, yes, we should be supporting that, but we're sitting talking about the nuances of language when 1.9 million people out of 2.2 million population are displaced. That's absolutely horrific figures, and women and children are being murdered every single day. So we have there's this moral shift that seems to be happening across the globe, that we're kind of moving into uncharted territory of what is appropriate behaviour. International law seems to be becoming less and less relevant. That takes me back to the physical border issue as well, because if we are beginning to, as a global entity, beginning to not recognise international law as much as we should, then anything else becomes possible. More wars across the borders become possible. The issue of right and justice becomes less and less achievable in those circumstances. So yes, there is a concern here. 1.9 million people, that's something like 80% of the population are now displaced. If you think about that and applying it to a Scottish context, it feels like it would inevitably spill over into those kind of situations. So yes, there is a lot of concern here. I think that Netanyahu is out of control. He's out of control, and we've seen demonstrations in Israel demanding the resignation of Netanyahu as well. So the Israeli population are not exactly happy with him either. But we have a kind of, we have a loose cannon in Israel at a time that's incredibly tense, and this is a terrifying point in our history, I think, in terms of peace and justice. So yeah, spilling over, but can spill over in a much bigger way than maybe what we're anticipating.
More locally, for the Scottish Government budget today, the Scottish Government has announced a £6.3 billion investment into social security and more than £19.5 billion for health and social at the heart of the Scottish budget for next year, which the Scottish Government says provides record funding for local authorities and frontline police and fire services. Deputy First Minister and Finance Secretary Shona Robinson has told Parliament that by targeting funding to invest in public services and protecting the most vulnerable, the budget underpins the social contract with the people of Scotland. She also outlined policies to grow the economy and progress via commitment to deliver a just transition to net zero. Ms. Robinson said that difficult decisions have been required to prioritise funding for the services people rely on in the face of a deeply challenging financial situation. The 2024 to 25 budget includes £6.3 billion for social security benefits, which will all be increased in line with inflation. This is £1.1 billion more than the funding received from the UK government for devolved benefits in 2024 to 2025. £13.2 billion for frontline NHS boards, with additional investment for more than £500 million in an uplifting of over 4%. Record funding of more than £14 billion for local government, including £144 million to enable local authorities to freeze council tax rates at their current levels. More than £1.5 billion for policing to support frontline services and key priorities such as body-worn cameras. almost £400 million to support the fire service, £200 million to help tackle the poverty-related attainment gap, almost £390 million to protect teacher numbers and fund the teacher pay deal, and up to £1.5 million to cancel school meal debt. Almost £2.5 billion for public transport to provide viable alternatives to car use, and increased investment of £220 million in active travel to promote walking, wheeling, and cycling. The Finance Secretary said, "The budget is set in turbulent circumstances. At a global level, the impacts of inflation, the war in Ukraine, and the after effects of the pandemic continues to create instability. In the UK, the combined effects of Brexit and disastrous Westminster policies mean that we are uniquely vulnerable to these international shocks. At its heart, it is our social contract with the people of Scotland, where those with the broadest shoulders are asked to contribute a little more, where everyone can have access to universal services and entitlements, and those in need of an extra helping hand will receive targeted additional support. We cannot mitigate every cut made by the UK government, but through the choices we have made, we have been true to our values and rigorous in prioritizing our investment where it will have the most impact." Councillor Tolland, I was wondering, in the run-up to the announcement of this budget, what were things that the Dundee Council were hoping for, and were any of these expectations met?
The word hope is perhaps kind of strong. I think that you've got hope as to what's going to happen, and then you've got a kind of a realistic expectation. I think that the 5% council tax will be seen as welcome. So that allows the councils a little bit of breathing space from Dundee City Council perspective anyway. Our highest, I think, increase in council tax has been something like 3.5%, but it was putting pressure on council. You know, the council finances across the board are not particularly good. We are in a better situation than certainly some English councils that are kind of turning bankrupt as a result of kind of, you know, the austerity agenda. So I think that's kind of made a difference. I think that the school debt, the school meal debt is something that's certainly welcome. It's certainly something that Dundee City Council has also done as well. The increase in social security payments is going to be an important one. Whilst it doesn't necessarily come directly to the council, what is the biggest issue for our councils, and certainly the biggest issue for me as a councillor is poverty, and those kind of real problems that we meet as a kind of city and as a society with that poverty. And one of the big things that Dundee City Council and actually the kind of the Fairness Forum across Dundee has been trying to do is to try and increase the uptake of benefits, and that's been actually quite successful to a certain extent. We have seen an increase in the amount of benefits that people have done, and that's through things like the welfare rights and so forth. So that increase in social security funding will be an important part, because what it will do is it will try and reduce those poverty figures. And of course, the increase in the Scottish Child Payment as well. These might not necessarily impact on the council directly, but indirectly it massively impacts on us, because our people are hungry, our people are cold, our people are, across the board. We're kind of, people are struggling across the board in terms of how they're going to fund their heating, how are they going to fund school dinners, how are they going to fund clothing, how are they going to fund all these things that, even just a couple of years ago, they were just kind of trying to keep their heads above water. For the councils, and I would say for each council, that's massively important that we've got that kind of new investment into the safety net. And I think for me, that's probably the most essential thing.
So focusing a little bit more on child poverty, obviously this has been stated as like one of like the big missions, one of the big goals for the SNP. I was wondering, in your time working with Dundee Council, have you seen a significant impact or help for families with children and the poverty they face?
The impact is It's almost at cross purposes here, because what we've actually got is a situation where I think that the Scottish Government and local councils, especially SNP led local councils, are trying to reduce poverty levels in a very kind of real and meaningful way. But what we've got is, against a 10-year of austerity agenda, we've got this almost stalemate. So we see a situation where we're kind of trying to reduce poverty, but the austerity agenda is increasing poverty across the board. So I'll give you an example of where kind of I think that things actually do impact. So and this is, I think it shows maybe contradiction as well. So since 2021, we've seen a fourfold increase of the use of food banks within Dundee. So that's risen from something like 1,000 to over 4,000, and that's before this winter comes in. That doesn't include things like community larders or community cafes either. What we did see was drops when Scottish Child Payment come in. So what you're actually seeing is, food bank rises go up, but when you get funding, it will go down, because people will feel that they're kind of keeping their heads above water. Then that goes up again because the price of fuel last year rocketed through the roof. Food inflation is absolutely ridiculous at that stage. So there's an element here where the Scottish Government, for all the goodwill in the world, and local councils for all the goodwill in the world, and Dundee City Council is one of the innovative areas across Scotland and the UK where we've tried to tackle child poverty at a very meaningful way. And it's an area where people, is where we're offering innovative kind of strategies there. So, but even with all that and all the best will in the world and all that retargeting of money that you might need to have, we're still up against a UK economy that literally sends us into austerity. So we're kind of like spending all this money to stand still. So you look at the discretionary housing payment, and I think that's a really good example. That's gone up from something like about 82 to 90 million in this budget. But something like 70 million of that goes to mitigating the ridiculous policies of the UK government. So that's like the bedroom tax or the rape clause and those kind of things. So we're mitigating so much of Westminster's austerity agenda that it's literally, we're spending that money just to keep still. So there is real problems here. And, it's not a surprise. I'm an SNP councillor, but this budget for me was very much, I think, a crunch moment. And I was aware of that when I was watching it today. And by that, I mean that we have huge decisions to make within the next year. And it's become very, very clear that Scotland and the UK, or Westminster's path, are increasingly divergent. You mentioned Shona Robinson's commitment to the social contract. She also committed the Scottish Government to a public health service, always free at the point of use. These are things that the Scottish people want and the Scottish Government are committed to. But what is happening in England through Westminster Parliament is that we're actually seeing a complete privatisation of health service and a decimation of public services as well. So we have to have the consequences of that. And the only way I think we can get out of that jam now is actually through independence, where we can have absolute control over the levers of our economy. But, that's not exactly a shock for people, because I am an SNP councillor, but I do think that the budget really laid that to ground today, and it really showed that kind of crunch moment that we have to decide now, what is it we need, what is it we want. Shona Robinson talked a lot about values today, the values of Scottish people and our values and commitment to the social contract and so forth. But it is the things like anti-poverty, social justice, those kind of values that the Scottish people have always, I think, especially since 1945, have been committed to. And it's the UK and Westminster that's actually moved away from that, and we've retained our commitment to that. But it becomes harder to do the more austerity that the Westminster government imposes upon us.
I was also wondering, on a smaller note, the budget also included culture funding to the effect of 15 million for over the next year. I was wondering, what does culture funding actually do? And I was wondering, maybe you would have specific insight, since Dundee obviously known for a lot of its cultural elements. How does this manifest within local constituencies? How does this manifest in cities? What does it mean to get culture funding?
I think that there's, I mean, I suppose it's a slightly different. I'm not quite sure how to answer that, to be perfectly honest. But it's, I mean, it's different things for it's different things for different contexts, isn't it? So there is there's like so we've got funding for like Scots language publications, or we've got funding for the arts in general. And one thing that we noticed through COVID was the importance of arts in terms of kind of our health and well-being, if that makes sense as well. So what you've got is that situation where it kind of needs to be kind of kept alive almost in order kind of to keep the population going and keep its spirits up to a certain extent. That's a kind of more philosophical kind of aspect of it. But in Dundee, of course, we have things like the DCA, and the DCA, I'm on the board of the DCA, so, declaration of interest there. But one of the things that the DCA tries to do is a lot of community art and working with local communities to try and get them to express themselves in lots of different ways. One project that kind of we're discussing at the moment, for instance, is an art project, a kind of graffiti art project about the cost of living crisis, not within the DCA, but from the local councils. So there's elements there where art becomes kind of a public expression and an expression of how people are faring in these difficult times. So art becomes really important and creativity becomes really important. So in that extent, I would hope that this new funding would allow avenues for that kind of element of it. I hope that answers your question.
No, absolutely. Thank you. I'll see here. Sorry. Yeah. I just wanted to say for an. So I think yesterday, the UK government increased funding for English councils by £64 billion, a 6.5%. By 6.5%. The 64 billion support package was announced today, less than a fortnight after. Okay. Okay. So obviously, UK government council tax changes will improve the Barnett formula. Will lead to like an extra £300 million in additional funding to Scotland. I should do. Do you think it will? Yeah. Do you think the Barnett consequentialist will be taken into account for this extra English council funding? Sorry.
I honestly not sure, and I was actually asking about that just earlier on, funnily enough, and I don't think there's any clarity in that, but it's maybe worth mentioning that this kind of extra money does include council tax rises, so it's not a complete UK government giving money to councils. The councils will be kind of raising some of their own through the council tax. My understanding of that is anyway. So I at this point I have no idea. Given that he said it was about English councils, then perhaps that might not be the case. I think the problem with Michael Gove is you maybe need to kind of, no offence, but you maybe need to take what he says with a pinch of salt, because he's not exactly known for his honesty. So I'll believe if we get that money, then yeah, okay, fair enough. I can't see that happening though. I think that what we've got is a situation where we're kind of, Scotland is kind of becoming is recently becoming kind of second fiddle to kind of the UK structure for very obvious reasons as well. But I have no idea whether we're going to get that money or not, and it's also not quite 6.5% complete funding either, to be fair.
Right. So, thank you so much. The Labour government in Wales.
I mean,
Also, would you like to comment on the increase in the Scottish budget tax? The changes to
yes,
taxation in the
yes.
Scottish budget?
I mean, yeah, I mean, I mean, it's not unexpected that we're going to see an advanced increase. So it's anything, I think it's over 75 thousand to 125,000 will be taxed at 45%, which is a couple of percent more than what we'd previously done. So for, the taxation beforehand was anything over 43,600, I think it is, was 43%, but now we've got that additional tax. That'll raise something like, I think Shona said 18 million, something like that, to be 5%. 18 million with those increases, yeah. So, in addition to that, the lower rate of tax, the 19% and the 20%, will be increased in line with inflation. So it means that you're kind of, you'll earn a little bit more before you start paying tax. I mean, I am for progressive taxes. I mean, I am making no bones about it. I think we should be working more progressive in terms of our taxation, but I think that this is a good start. I think it's the right thing to do, and it was one of the things that Shona was very clear about, I think, in the budget today, is that she said it a few times, those with the broadest shoulders have to meet the costs of the funding our public services, or at least some of those costs in the public service. That's the social contract. That is the social contract. That's what we decided in 1945, and that's what we decided. That's what we want to keep. And that effectively is that those with the most amount of money will pay more to allow for those with the least amount of money to have a safety net, and the safety net is vitally important. So I am very, very keen on progressive taxation. Personally, I would go further, and I hope that kind of once we kind of settle into kind of the next few years that we maybe think about that, because we have a decision to make now as a society, I think. And this comes back to the kind of two factions that, England's working in a very different way, much more right wing, much more privatised, less investment in public services. But if we want public services, we are going to have to find ways of paying for it. And one of the ways of paying for it is taxation, and taxation through the most, for those with the highest income. That seems fair to me. That is the fair way to do it. So yes, I think that was a very, very welcome move. I would be, if I was put it this way, if I was on 75 grand, I wouldn't mind paying an extra couple of 2%. I wouldn't mind paying an extra couple of 2%, a couple of percent now, actually, if it means we can save our NHS and our public services, because that's what becomes important. So yeah, I'm very, very welcome of this decision today.
Thank you. And I guess on that note, do you think that other people will mind? Do you think that these raises to taxation, they could drive people away from Scotland, or reduce the appeal for people that may have been considering to come here in the first place?
I know that tends to be a narrative that tends to be put out once, because Scotland's taxation is different from the UK's, and higher, those with higher income are taxed actually slightly more. But the evidence doesn't necessarily suggest that. Shona Robertson was just saying that on Sunday Politics on Sunday, that actually. The shift from within the UK to Scotland is actually quite high, because actually even those that are rich, within the rich tax bracket, even those people who have that and do pay more tax, you still get a lot back for your money in terms of that social contract. We get free prescriptions, we get free university tuitions, we have things like the child payment that kind of prevents poverty. We have an investment in our health service, which is which is there for absolutely every single person that lives within Scotland. So there we get a lot back from our money. We're not a high taxation society, and I think that it's maybe worthwhile saying that. Yes, our income tax is different, and yes, we do tax higher on income tax, but across the board in overall taxation, we're not a high taxation country, because there's other ways of doing it, because what you get back in return is actually much better. We get much better investment in public services, as we've seen. So we get a lot back for that level of taxation. We also have the lowest council tax, by the way, in the UK. So it's not exactly just about income tax. There's other versions of tax as well that we have to consider, and we are by far quite much lower in some areas than England in terms of the council tax too. So it's Honestly, I think that question. I think that that narrative comes from a wee bit of kind of scaremongering, in terms of progressive. It's that kind of assumption that all people with money always want to kind of grab onto their money. If we're serious about doing a well-being economy, then we have to kind of get people on board and actually make the wealthier understand that for that extra 2p in the pound that you might need to pay, you will get a better, healthier, more productive society in the long run. So this is an investment as well as everything else. So it's changing that narrative. It's not about these people kind of in the richer tax band being kind of having to kind of pay more money. They do get back a better society, a more fruitful society, and a fairer society, and that is good for everyone.
Thank you. Um, Still on the topic of budget announcements, the Labour government in Wales announces a raft of cuts to public spending. The Labour-led government in Wales has announced wide-ranging cuts to public services in areas from policing to flood risk management, culture and sport, all announced today. The Welsh government say the cuts are intended to help it protect the NHS and support local councils. Its draft budget, which was published today, also includes plans to reduce business rate reliefs for pubs, restaurants, and shops, which means many will be facing rises in bills from April. In addition, the budget flags up the possibility of increases in the cost of NHS dental care, university tuition fees, and home care for elderly people, and says rail fares will have to rise. The Welsh Finance Minister, Rebecca Evans, said the protection of the NHS and frontline local council services, such as schools and social care, was at the heart of the 2024 to 25 draft budget. She said there would be an extra £450 million from the NHS, and the core local government settlement would increase by 3.1%. But said that even with these rises, health boards and the councils faced a very difficult year. The Welsh government said that as a result of high inflation, Wales's overall budget was worth £1.3 billion less in real terms than it was set in 2021 and the settlement, which largely comes from the UK government in the form of a block grant, and was not sufficient to respond to the extreme pressures that public services, businesses, and people were facing. The biggest hits in the £23 billion budget came in the rural affairs and climate change departments. The latter included transport, housing, and natural resources of Wales. Business rate relief for pubs, shops, and restaurants will be reduced from 75% to 40%. The Welsh government said the discount, which dates to the pandemic, was never intended to continue indefinitely. Now, obviously, Wales does not have the same tax variable rights that Scotland has. Do you think that that is the primary factor driving all of these cuts in Wales?
I have sympathy with Wales, because we're all in the same position where we're kind of subject to kind of massive cuts. Neither Wales or Scotland voted for Liz Truss and the kamikaze budget that's kind of put us in this position. So there is an element there of problematic. I think that there's an element that they've tried, but I'm listening, and to be honest, I haven't had time to kind of read the draft budget in detail. I did a little bit, but not much. But I think that it makes me genuinely grateful that we're in Scotland and we are making those slightly different choices. So you were talking about one of the cuts being in public transport. Well, actually, the increase in national transport in Scotland is increasing by actually quite a fair bit in this budget, because it's the understanding that we must invest in public transport in order to push forward the wellbeing economy and an eco-friendly economy as well. So there is an element that I think as countries parties, we both feel that our hands are being very much tied behind our backs. It's certainly, from a Scottish perspective, it puts Scottish Labour in an incredibly difficult position. I mean, I don't know if you watched the debate after the budget statement, but Shona Robertson was very strong in terms of, you know, why is it here it's the SNP's fault, but in Wales it's the UK government's fault? So it puts them in Labour in a bit of a dilemma there. Who do they blame? Because, you know, Wales is kind of making more stringent cuts than the SNP even. And I say that because I mean there are cuts because there's inevitable cuts across the board where hands are tied. It's a difficult one. I think there's an understanding, though, that we never asked for this. And I think this is a kind of democratic issue as well. Wales never asked for it. They never asked for this absolutely horrific, tackling of the COVID crisis that caused so many more problems than we needed. We never asked for increasingly right-wing governments, and we never asked for 10 years of austerity either. All this stuff has been imposed on both Scotland and Wales. To a certain extent, I think the SNP are faring better. I think they're making more social democratic decisions. But I can see that, you know, Wales are trying to, you know, they're trying to focus on things like the NHS and so forth. So there's sympathy there that at least they're kind of trying.
Thank you so much. The SNP say the fact Michelle Mone had the whip removed and is no longer a Conservative Party member does not let her nor the Tories off the hook. The SNP has said that removing the whip from Baroness Michelle Mone and the fact she is no longer a Conservative Party member should let neither her nor the Tories off the hook for the scandal surrounding PPE contracts. The Conservative Party confirmed on Monday that Michelle Mone is no longer a member, after having lost the Conservative whip last year in the House of Lords. Miss Mone was made a Conservative peer in 2015 by then Prime Minister, and now Foreign Secretary and Lord's colleague David Cameron. Mary Black, MP, the SNP's Deputy Westminster leader, warned the Tories would cynically hide behind her removal of the whip and lack of membership as a way to dodge responsibility for the saga, but said that where wrongdoing has occurred, there must be consequences. Commenting, Mary Black, MP, has said, "The Tories will try to cynically hide behind a removal from the party, her removal from the party, but they shouldn't be allowed to dodge responsibility for the part they've played in this. Mone was a Conservative member, Conservative peer, and benefited in millions of pounds from this unscrupulous Conservative government. That cannot be forgotten or ignored. The UK government must make public all documentation relating to the botched procurement of PPE during the pandemic, and acknowledge that her dodgy deals failed to deliver the necessary equipment at a huge cost of the taxpayer, as well as the safety of public sector workers." The more this story develops, the murkier it gets for Mone, and for the Tories, whose handling of a pandemic and public money has rightly outraged voters across the country. Councillor, I was wondering, since Michelle Mone is still within the House of Lords, what does it mean for our institutions of power if they can be ran and influenced by those confirmed to lie and suspected of wielding that power for personal gain?
With all due respect, we had a Prime Minister that lied with every word he said. Boris Johnson was continuously lying. You know, we knew that at every single breath that he took, he was literally lying. He'd been done for lying as a journalist previously, before he even became Prime Minister. So Michelle Mone I'm not defending Michelle Mone by any means, but she's not the only one. And this is what it comes down to, and this is what the SNP's point was, actually, wasn't it? That yes, Michelle Mone should be taken to the coals for this. I mean, her interview was absolutely horrendous. She should be taken to the coals for, what was it, 600,000 they made off of that PPE contract? But she's not the only one to be corrupt. She's not the only one to be lying as well. We had a Prime Minister at the heart of government that was lying with every breath he made. So this is endemic now. And that's the problem that we now have. You just need to look even half an hour kind of dipping into that inquiry into COVID to understand what the level of incompetence, corruption, toxicity, lying that's going on, and the absolute lack of responsibility that anybody is taken. It is childlike in its process. It wasn't me, it was him, or it wasn't me, it was her. Now, Michelle Mone should be taken to the cause, and I'm very, very clear in that. But she is a scapegoat in the sense that, as the SNP said, if they think if they just take her out of the party, then somehow they can absolve themselves of responsibility. But they encouraged that culture in which she made that money. She didn't do that in isolation. The first person she phoned was Michael Gove, and said, yeah, go for it. And then that spiral happened. She's not the only one. She's part of a bigger system that's actually we're beginning to see that all coming out. The profiteering that was happening within that was not just Michelle Mone, it had an infrastructure behind it. Because actually, when you've got a political and economic system where they're only driving forces to make a profit, it's the only thing they knew what to do within a COVID pandemic. And it was utterly the wrong thing to do. So yes, she should have had the whip removed. Of course, she should have had the whip removed, but it does not absolve the Conservative Party of any responsibility, because they didn't just actively encourage her in that process, they actively encouraged it amongst absolutely everybody. Their behaviour during COVID was utterly shocking, and they deserve never to be in government again. So I feel quite strongly about this, as you can see.
Thank you. The UK government has announced a cut to the asylum seeker allowance to just £1.25, £1 and 25 pence a day. The UK government has said that tens of thousands of asylum seekers forced to live in hotels in the UK while their claims are being processed will have their allowance cut to £1 and 25 pence a day. Support payments for those in hotel accommodation will be cut to £9 and 58 pence a week, from £9 and 58 pence a week to £8 and 86 pence a week in the new year. In the decision, refugee charities have the decision has been called unfathomable by refugee charities. The change was disclosed in a statutory instrument, which was quietly released by the Home Office last week. There's been a growing backlash among Conservative backbenchers over the £8 million a day cost to the taxpayer to house people seeking asylum. UK government ministers promised to end the use of hotels in May 2021, but were struggling to set up the Rwanda deportation plan that they hoped would deter small boat crossings across the channel. Enver Solomon, the chief executive of a refugee council, said the change in the rules would plunge more people seeking asylum into poverty and destitution. People seeking asylum are not allowed to work, pay taxes, or arrange their own accommodation while their claims are being processed. Those living in hotels do not pay for accommodation, meals, and toiletries. But costs such as travel, over-the-counter medication, mobile phone data, clothes, and other essentials must be met by the weekly allowance. About 50,000 people are being forced to stay in adapted and restrictive hotels on a tightly controlled sustenance budget while waiting for a decision. Councillor, I was wondering, are you convinced that the UK government are doing everything in their power to process these refugees and their claims?
No, of course they're not. This is a hostile environment. They're very open about the fact that it is a hostile environment. They make things incredibly difficult to come across. You just need to look at what they're doing like with the Rwanda thing. It is utterly, it's not that they're not doing everything they can. They're actively discouraging it almost violently, in a way to kind of try and prevent. And it goes back to that insularity I talked about at the very start. The kind of reaction of global crisis is not to think about global crises and our relationship to that, but to think about how does that affect us on a very, very narrow level. I think it's absolutely shocking the things that's happening. And we've got a situation in Gaza, for instance, where you've got to get a biometric, paperwork to get refugee status, but that's been bombed. So, but the UK are still insisting that people need that paperwork. So, how does it defies utter logic? There is no compassion in that system. It's nothing but cruelty at this moment in time, to be perfectly frank with you. And that reduction in the weekly allowance, oh my God, how does anybody expected to live off of that allowance? Is absolutely shocking. And that is deliberate. It's a deliberate political decision to punish those that are most vulnerable. And I think been thinking about this quite a lot, actually, about what is it that defines the right. Is it, there's certain things that kind of, there's certain kind of strategies and there's certain philosophies that often define the right. But I think ultimately, at its essence, it's about punishing people that are weaker than ourselves, punishing our most vulnerable. And the instinct seems to be to punish people. And that's what's happening with the asylum and the refugees that are entering here. Vulnerable people that are fleeing war-torn and terrifying kind of situations, and they're met with utter cruelty, actually. So are they doing enough? They are not doing enough. They are actively trying to kind of fight against them. I would encourage people to read the Scottish Government's immigration paper that was published a few weeks ago. This is a vision for when an independent Scotland occurs and how our immigration would be. It is the exact opposite from the Westminster cruelty.
Thank you. A volcano erupts on the Reykjanes Peninsula in Iceland today. A volcano on the Reykjanes Peninsula in the southwest Iceland has erupted after weeks of intense earthquake activity, spewing glowing orange jets of lava surrounded by billowing clouds of red smoke. Eruption has started north of Grindavik by Hagafell, the Iceland Meteorological Office said on its website on Monday. The eruption started a few kilometers from Grindavik, a fishing town located about 40 kilometers southwest of Iceland's capital, Reykjavik. The town, with a population of 4,000 people, was evacuated in November after the area was hit by a seismic swarm of more than 1,000 small earthquakes in 24 hours. On Tuesday, the Icelandic government said the eruption did not present a risk to life, adding that there were no disruptions to flights to and from Iceland, while international flight corridors remained open. Although unlikely, as this type of eruption does not usually produce much ash, experts say there could yet be some effects on air travel. Iceland's Prime Minister, Katrín Jakobsdóttir, said her thoughts were with the people of Grindavik. Now we see the earth opening up. The Icelandic Met Office initially said the magma was moving to the southwest and that the eruption might continue in the direction of Grindavik. Then, the crack in the Earth's surface was about 3.4 kilometers long and had grown rapidly. Between 100 and 200 cubic meters of lava was emerging per second, several times more than in previous eruptions of the year. However, by late morning today, lava from the eruption appeared to be flowing away from the town, offering hope that homes that have survived the weeks of earthquakes in Grindavik might be spared. The southernmost point of the fissure, which had since grown to 4 kilometers long, was still 3 kilometers away from Grindavik, the Met Office said. Now, the pictures from this have just been absolutely terrifying. I'm sure the councillor would join me in just sympathy for the people that have been forced to evacuate their homes and completely change their way of life for this disaster completely out of their own control.
Yeah, yeah. I visited Iceland 2000, just Christmas 2019 actually, and one of the things we were interested in, and was looking at the impacts of previous volcanic explosions, or so forth. And it's kind of it kind of engulfs whole villages, whole towns, and it is quite a kind of a scary experience. And the earth is I mean, it's not a surprise that kind of a lot of geologists go across to Iceland, because it's fascinating geologically speaking. It's the only place on earth where you can see the gape and the Earth's crust as well. We went to see that too. But yeah, I mean, it's a horrendously scary time actually. I think that there's an element that people, you never get you get used to it, but you don't get used to it, if that makes sense. Kind of people in Iceland are aware of their terrain quite powerfully so, but these kind of things, when they happen, it's scary and it's terrifying, and you literally have to kind of rebuild your life again. So good news that it's moving away. The lava's moving away from the villages, and that everyone has been successfully evacuated as well. Because these are a kind of scary times to a certain extent.
Thank you. The SNP, an SNP MP has launched a new bid to pardon miners convicted of offences strikes in the 1980s. Owen Thompson has presented a bill to the UK Parliament today calling for a law change to overturn the convictions of hundreds of miners during the violent industrial dispute. The MP for Midlothian, a former mining constituency, has argued passionately in Parliament for the need to right what he has considered what he called a historical injustice, and wants to extend a law passed in Scotland last year to England and Wales. The Miners' Strike Pardons Scotland Act 2022 took effect from 27th July 2022 and provides a collective and automatic pardon for former miners. Household members of a miner, parents, siblings, and children of a miner who were convicted for a breach of a peace, breaching bail conditions, and an offence under Section 41(1)(a) of the Police Scotland Act 1967, such as police obstruction. Mr. Thompson has previously called for Labour leader Keir Starmer to support his campaign for including a pardon for English and Welsh miners in his general election manifesto, but has yet to receive a response. Commenting, Owen Thompson MP said, a miner's pardon would be a powerful symbol of reconciliation. It would show we are prepared to put the past behind us and move on. The miners' strike of 1984 to 1985 was one of the most bitter and divisive events in British history. It was a time when the miners, who were fighting for their jobs and their communities, were met with the full force of the state. Under Thatcher, thousands of miners were arrested and many were convicted of offences such as breach of a peace, obstruction of a police, and breach of bail conditions. These convictions were a travesty of justice. They were fighting for their livelihoods and their future of their communities, he said. Councillor Tolland, what has caused the UK to lag behind Scotland's decision to pardon these miners?
A right-wing agenda. I mean, Thatcher came in on the promise to break the unions, and the miners' strike was part of that. She artificially inflated the price of coal-based electricity in order to do that. The transition was an extremely punishing one. This comes back again to the punishment of those who are weakest. And the attempt there was not just to kind of, transition into other energy, but to punish and destroy the National Unemployed Workers. The National Mine Workers Union back then. So there was, so that history, it's still embedded within the Conservative government. In fact, if anything, they've moved more to the right than Margaret Thatcher did. So that's why they're lagging, because they have a kind of right wing a right-wing anti-union agenda, and we can see that by the current anti-strike clause that they've brought in. This is why they're lagging behind. Scotland works again on a different philosophy. We try to work with unions. We cooperate with unions. We ask unions to their opinion on how to build our economies and so forth. The UK Westminster government doesn't, and actually this is why Keir Starmer is silent in that as well. In the 1980s, I remember this. I'm old enough to remember this as a child, but on reflection, look back in history as well. It was a pivotal moment for the Labour Party in the fact that they didn't support the miners' strike, and were very, very reticent to give their support. This is a Labour Party who was supported by unions, so they began to withdraw their support there as well. So it's Labour's shame there historically too that they didn't support the miners who were trying to fight for their jobs and save their jobs. Communities were absolutely decimated, and it's still culturally, historically, a very deep-seated wound in a lot of old mining areas. We still talk about it. It's like Dundee. We talk about the Timex strike quite a lot. It's a strong part of our history, and the miners' strike was like that as well. It does become part of the healing if we start on that process, but I'm not necessarily sure the Conservative government or the Labour government at this stage are really interested in that kind of healing, to be perfectly frank with you.
Thank you so much for your time with us, Councillor Siobhan Tolland. That'll wrap up us for this evening. Before I go, I just wanted to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. So, to everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. Our programme will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. Our need to reach our goal of £30,000 target to pay our bills is still pressing. Due to the generosity of our supporters, we have raised over £22,000. However, our need to raise the remaining £8,000 is really, really urgent. Good night, and thank you for watching.